Welcome to China Tech Talk, the weekly discussion of technology and startups here in China. I am John Artman, editor-in-chief of TechNote, and as always, I'm joined by Matthew Brennan, founder of China Channel. And so as the year comes to an end, Matt and I thought we would take a look back at the year of 2017 and just discuss some of the highlights, discuss some of the things that we found to be most interesting. And so we've got our top five. We've also got some honorable mentions that we'll discuss briefly towards the end. And if you are on any modern podcast player that supports chapters, you should be able to very, very clearly see each single topic marked out, so that way you can jump to whichever topic you would like to hear about. So just very, very quick, so that you guys can know what we're going to be talking about. So number one, sharing economy. Number two, globalization, so Chinese companies going abroad. Number three is crypto, so ICOs, Bitcoin, and things like that in China. Number four is live streaming and video. And number five is Tencent's entertainment empire. And so if you want to skip ahead, feel free to do so. So at number one, sharing economy. So for Matt, for you, what was the highlight?
I think this is candidate for the big one, right? The big trend of late 2016 and early 2017, but it's still playing out now, right? It's still going strong, and that's the bike sharing. And it was so crazy, right? Back in February and March, suddenly the streets of China were filled with these bikes, and everyone kind of freaked out. And we've never really seen anything like it. I think it's comparable to the Uber Didi war previously, but this one I think was more visible and more interesting in many different ways, and totally unexpected, right? I don't think anyone really saw this coming. Even the companies themselves would never think that this phenomenon would get so big.
Because we're looking in terms of trends. I mean, this along with mobile payments is one of the bigger trends to come out of China. And so previously, I think ride hailing is a very good example, because before Didi and Kuaidi really got started, we already knew about Uber. We already knew about Lyft. Those were gaining traction in the States already. And then, of course, I mean, it's just, of course, in China, they're going to try to do something like that. Of course, there's going to be a company that tries to aggregate taxi hailing, or aggregate, private car hailing or something like that. But with bike sharing, it was different, because it's this typical Chinese kind of thing. I think that. So the classic trope that's been used when talking about bike rentals in China has been that China is returning back to its bike past, and I think that actually, while cliched now because it's been overused, it is quite true. I mean, you look at photos back from the 80s, the 70s and 80s in Beijing, at least. I mean, it's all bikes, very, very, very few cars. And so I think that's certainly part of it, that it has a very strong kind of cultural hook already. Also, bikes are more affordable than cars. Bikes are even more affordable than ride hailing. And as you say, Matt, I think that they were much more visible. I mean, there's always been cars on the road, but suddenly, bam, there's this huge number of bikes suddenly clogging up the streets.
Yeah. And with Didi and Uber, yes, they did burn a lot of money, but they didn't need to. If there was a situation like now where it's more sort of a monopoly, then there's not really much burning to go on. It's a very different business model. Whereas making physical bikes, making tens of millions of these bikes is something that is surprising. It just brings into focus, I think, of how much money these guys actually spend. And for ride sharing. I think they were also spending incredible amounts of money, but it's not so visible. It's more sort of coupons and discount codes, which are sort of virtual. Whereas what the money was being spent on here, a lot of it was very physical and real. And you could see it and touch it and be like, oh my God, like how much are these guys spending to produce all these bikes across the entire of China? It's just brings home exactly the scale of how these internet companies operate.
Yeah, I think that's a really really good point, because for me there's parallel with what we saw with bike rentals or bike sharing with Tuangou that happened back in 2013 2014, and at that time there was this huge explosion of there are lots of different small companies, all these apps, the big players are getting involved, and there was just all this activity. And of course, there's scams, people stealing money, people selling fake discounts, that they had no right to promise, and so on and so on. And that was virtual. That was all just happening on a smartphone, on a computer, and in people's minds. Whereas with bike rentals, it's been all on the streets. And I have to say that that it on the one hand, I do think that bike rentals have solved a real pain point, and there is data suggesting that that bike rentals have reduced congestion on some major roads, especially during rush hour and especially around subway stations. So I think that there's a lot to be said for the benefits. The negatives, of course, there's always trade-offs. The negatives for me, as someone who rides an electric bike and has been riding an electric bike, since for 6 or 7 years now, the bike rentals have become quite annoying, because on the one hand you have a lot more bikes in the bike lane, you have a lot more people who don't usually ride bikes riding bikes in the bike lane, which can actually be slightly dangerous. And then where I used to park my bike, there was open space. There was so much space where I could park my bike pretty much whatever I wanted. Now there's much less space, and security guards, property management people, they're much more vigilant about where people are parking their bikes. So I think that on the one hand, there have been some real benefits. There's also some real negatives. Even recently, we published a few pieces about some of the environmental impacts of the bike shares. And just today, as of this recording, we published a piece looking at the cost of picking up all these abandoned bikes. I'm sure, Matt, you've seen these pictures of either municipal authorities or just people just dumping bikes outside of a city. And apparently, one of the reasons that these bike rental companies have not done anything with these bike graveyards is because it just ends up being too expensive, and it would take too long. And so it's really interesting to see that again, it's trade-off, right? There have been some positive impacts, but the number of unused bikes that I see on a daily basis, and some of the bike congestion that is caused is certainly a negative aspect of all this.
And it's not just bikes. So we're talking about sharing economy. We have to mention power banks. And that was probably number 2. Less sexy, less interesting, certainly. There's no huge graveyards full of power banks for us to take photos of.
Right. That would be very dangerous, actually.
That probably would be, yeah. So less glamorous, but an important trend for this year. And again, the same sort of questions about the business model are arising. These services are really cheap, and they've spent a lot of money on buying a lot of power banks. And this links into the mobile payments trend as well in the same way. And then we got the little ones like even the umbrella sharing. That was quite funny, but I only saw a couple of pictures on that. I don't think it ever really took off, did it? Umbrella sharing?
No, it never
No.
did. And you know what else didn't really take off was the sex doll sharing. I think
Right.
that was operational for about a day.
Yeah, that one. That was a funny one. Yeah. Um, and there was basketball sharing, and
Basketballs,
there
yeah.
was what else was there? There was a couple of other silly ones. Anyway, nothing like the bikes. The power banks is number two, I think, and that was
Well, even then, the power banks I think was a bunch of BS anyway. I think the only real business model to come out of the sharing economy was the bikes. The power banks is kind of, but we saw a lot of money go into them, and then just recently a bunch of them closed. I think there's only one, if I remember correctly, that's still operational. Um, and we can see that with bike shares as well. That Blue Gogo recently had their whole thing.
right.
They had a lot of people asking for money, and they were not able to make a lot of refunds. The CEO is nowhere to be found, and they recently filed for bankruptcy. Cool Chi is in a very similar position. Those are the ones, if you remember, that had the partnership with Hayar. So Hayar is an appliances and HVAC manufacturer, and they had those gold bikes that came out earlier this year over the summer. That was in a very similar position. Couldn't make refunds. Had people lined up outside their offices in Tongzhou trying to get their money back. Hello Bike was acquired by Youan. Which is actually kind of funny because Youan is actually a government owned bike rental company, and they actually went IPO early this year. And so we can see that this whole space is heated up and matured, I would say, very, very quickly. And it seems, Matt, I mean, like yeah, so just recently you shared a really interesting article on Caixin looking at the finances of the two big ones, Ofo and Mobike.
Yeah, that was a really good article. Let's put that in the notes as well. I was quite surprised that they printed that because they quoted an unnamed source who had knowledge, I think, of the financials, knowledge of the investors and what was going on behind the scenes, what is going on behind the scenes, and from that article. It seems that there's definitely talks of mergers behind the scenes, and actually they've been going on for a couple of months, and they've been sidetracked now because of a couple of reasons. One, they're concerned about Didi having too much control of the merged company. Secondly, Alibaba and Tencent are fighting, unsurprisingly, and thirdly, I think also there's concern about the amount of cash reserves that Ofo has. So they seem to be pretty low. And it seems that Ali's had to prop them up recently with an injection of cash, which has kind of skewed the negotiations and put them on hold for a while. Whether it's true or not, we don't really know. But Sightseeing's a pretty reliable source. So
Yeah, I would say so.
I would say, and they haven't. It's an unnamed source. I would say it's more likely than not that this is actually true. And
Yeah, I
yeah,
tend to agree. And my sense is that looking at Ofo in particular is in a bit of a difficult position right now. You look at the beginnings of the company, and the company was created by college students who were trying to make the world a better place, make life for people on college campus better. They can rent out their unused bikes, make some money, and at the same time, other people who don't have a bike or they don't have it at hand can use it very, very easily. And I really do have to wonder if they kind of knew what they were getting into when it comes to all the money that they accepted. I think it really kind of feels like they're almost like a Facebook idealistic. I mean, an idealistic version of Facebook. So college kids who just didn't quite, perhaps are a bit over their heads, And from what I understand, the executive team is a bit embattled right now with their investors, because their investors are asking them. They're saying, hey, you got to cut costs, but how do you cut costs, or how do you increase profitability, when you're spending so much money on, as we mentioned before, actually manufacturing these bikes, and then the cost of operation for these bikes and for the user is very, very low. I think Mobike is 1 RMB per hour, and that's the lowest. The lowest unit is like 1 RMB per hour, and then for Ofo it's half a renminbi per hour, and even if you look at the number of people using all these bikes, the numbers don't add up in terms of profitability.
Yeah, right now they don't. Yeah, which is why they're saying there has to be a merger, and that's the only way out. Is the sort of conclusion of the article, which yeah, I mean, I'm increasingly thinking that is the case now. Before at the beginning of the year, I wasn't, but it's played out that way, it seems. So. I think as a first prediction for 2018, we're quite likely to see a merger. I think given how things look now in December 2017, it's an easy prediction there, I think.
Yeah,
let's have a look at the next trend, John.
Yeah, let's look at so part of it's actually kind of funny because I think this segues in. Sorry, 1 second. So actually, I think this segues in really, really nicely into number 2, which is globalization, because both companies have been very serious about their globalization push, making trying to make as many headlines as possible about their expansion. With Ofo even going so far as getting Rihanna on board for their UK push, and just recently, Mobike announced funding in cooperation with Line for their Japanese expansion. And so what Mobike has done is they've created a joint. Well, not. They've created a subsidiary, a Japan-based company. That just got investment from Line, and so they're fairly serious about their global expansion. But I think again, looking at the companies themselves, how profitable is it actually going to be, and really kind of where the ROI is a bit questionable. But of course, there's the globalization is a much bigger topic. I mean, we're talking also about WeChat Pay and Alipay going abroad, setting up more places where Chinese users can pay using these methods. Xiaomi has had a buster year in India. They look like they're becoming much stronger in Southeast Asia. And then, of course, there's all of the other big players moving into Southeast Asia as well.
Yep. Yeah, it's an increasing trend. So we're going to definitely see more of this in 2018. The internet in China is maturing in terms of the big battles have been fought and won. It's increasingly a fight between Tencent and Alibaba. There are obviously a lot of players in the mix, not just them, but they seem to have their empires set up now. Not to say that there's not going to be anything interesting happening next year. I'm sure there'll be tons, and lots that we can't predict today. But it's certainly a trend that they're all looking at the international market outside China as something that in many ways is easier than in China now. That the low-hanging fruit's all gone, and it's actually easier to expand outside. I mean, we've had companies from China that have done pretty well internationally for quite some time, right? So Cheetah Mobile is a good example. They've done really well.
Huawei.
Huawei. They've done it exceptionally well in areas like drones as well. I think China's got some pretty strong companies there that have internationalized really, really well. But certainly there was a few more, and I think you've mentioned many of them already. So let's just go a little bit deeper into some of those. So If we look at like Alipay, WeChat, so that's a pretty important trend because those are the two big guys, and so yeah, we've seen just a flurry of announcements in the past few months, especially about Alipay and WeChat Pay opening up across all different types of markets in Europe, and this is in Europe and the States as well. So usually we haven't seen too much action from those guys in the more mature markets, in the Western markets, but for these payment services, we're seeing that now. So that's a pretty good indicator that there'll be more of this in those more of this in those more developed markets later on, because I think even for our listeners, right, especially if you're in the States, you might these companies, what we're talking about here that's happening in China doesn't really touch your life that much, but you might start to see Alipay signs pop up or WeChat Pay signs pop up wherever there's Chinese tourists now, even in the States. And so I think that's one of the first sort of like, oh wow, this is here now type moments.
Yeah, I was just in Italy, and one of the things that I'm just, it's always a bit painful for me to leave China now, even going to Hong Kong as I did a few months ago, because the ecosystem here in China, I mean, powered by mobile payments, is just so amazing and so convenient. That I'm going to the States tomorrow. I just went to Italy, and it's just very, very painful. And I think that it's actually really interesting because I was talking to some startups in Italy about China market entry, and I was talking with one who's trying to do some type of cultural QR code based AR VR experience in association with some cultural institutions in Italy. And I was like, you guys, I mean, this is the perfect vector for China market entry, is actually getting tourists in Italy. And so instead of trying to banging your head against a wall, trying to talk to, Chinese museums and things like that, which I think would be very difficult, just, you provide a special experience for Chinese users there, and then they take it back with them. And so I think that, it's really kind of interesting seeing how, on the one hand, these companies are going global. And for Alipay and WeChat and WeChat Pay, a lot of their global expansion now has just been kind of riding on the backs of Chinese consumers. But then also, using that yourself, if you run a business in China, if you run a business in the United States, if you run a business in Europe or anywhere around the world, using Chinese tourists as your vector into the China market, I think is a huge opportunity.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. And let's not forget that Alipay and WeChat are also now opening up properly in Malaysia. So that's a big stepping stone, right? That's a major market outside of China, where it's not just Chinese tourists. They're opening up the full version of their wallet features. And I'm sure they'll be, in 2018, they're going to pour a lot of resources into making that a success in that market.
Yeah, I think for China, Southeast Asia, 2018 is all about is going to be all about Southeast Asia. We've seen it. Sure. We've seen it kind of begin, I think, towards the end of this year. But I keep hearing people say, that Southeast Asia is China 5 years ago. And China 5 years ago was still very much a blue ocean. Where, as you were saying before, now things have really kind of settled down. The low-hanging fruit has already been eaten. Well, the low-hanging fruit, I mean, that's what's always kind of interesting, because you looked at the copy to China model of a lot of internet companies, and they were taking the low-hanging fruit that worked in other markets and adapting it to China. And now it looks like what they're going to be doing is they're doing a copy from China to Southeast Asia, using a lot of their products and a lot of their business models that have proven successful in China, and opening them up in places where nothing like it exists.
Yeah, I'd agree with that broadly. I mean, I've been to quite a few countries in Southeast Asia this year, and yeah, it does feel a bit like China before in some ways in many of the places. And yeah, when you go to all the airports there, like they have Alipay, WeChat Pay have a decent presence in many of them. Yeah, and I think if people want to know more about this trend, the conversation we had with Bernard on the podcast was pretty good for this particular topic. He's actually, he's based in Singapore and is quite familiar with all the investments going on in the region. So perhaps we should reference back to that one if we want to cover that trend a bit more. But yeah, for sure, we're going to be seeing a lot more investments in that area. Alibaba's e-commerce empire is they're lining things up quite nicely, I think, across Southeast Asia in terms of logistics. And Tencent's making a whole ton of investments. Like we say, in India, they've pretty much invested in a lot of key players. And as you mentioned before, Xiaomi's really killing it in India, right? They're really killing it. I think they're number one now.
Yeah.
And again, we had an interview with them on the podcast at TechCrunch. I think that was a couple of episodes ago. So you can go back and listen to that one if you want to find out more about Xiaomi. But they're I think they're number one now. I think they've taken Samsung, and that's happened really just in the last 4 or 5 quarters.
And then
so it's been an incredible journey.
So they're number one. Apple and Samsung are 2 and 3, and then 4 and 5 are Oppo and Vivo. So Chinese companies are 3 out of 5. 3 out of 5 in India, which is amazing. And I think that the explanation, I think, is pretty obvious. I mean, the India market is in some senses similar to the China market, in particular price sensitivity. And all of these companies, they're able to offer a premium. Well, in the case of Xiaomi, they're able to offer a premium product at non-premium prices. Oppo and Vivo, I have to admit, I'm not too familiar with their products, but they do offer lower end devices, which is perfect for the India market. And all 3 of them, including Huawei as well, are moving into Southeast Asia too, with very, very successfully. But the thing is, I mean, it's not just like these big players. It's also a lot of venture capital and a lot of startups are beginning to look more at Southeast Asia as an area of growth. And so again, I think that really what we see in China right now domestically is that things are slowing down. The economy is just not growing as fast. The big players have kind of staked out their territory, and if you want to scale, you're probably going to have to partner with them to a certain degree, give up certain rights of your or equity in your company in order to have them as a strategic partner, and that's really how you're going to succeed in China. Whereas in Southeast Asia, there's still that opportunity to really kind of make your mark, to get in there. But then also, just the number of opportunities in Southeast Asia as their economies develop more and more is continuing to increase. And so, I mean, I think that we can see a lot. We're going to see a lot more Chinese companies, a lot more Chinese money going to Southeast Asia, but then a lot more interaction in general with Southeast Asia. And so maybe even Southeast Asia companies coming to China.
And of course, we can't forget Musical.ly and Meitu Shushu, who both smashed it in the States, right? I think that's a trend we haven't seen before up until this year, where for Musical.ly, they're based in Shanghai and they built the app there, and it's done. Nobody really uses it in China, but it's done incredibly well in America. But Meitu is a little bit different. They're also very, very popular in China, but their app also at one stage garnered a lot of attention for their features. They're beautifying facial features, and they also got criticized quite a bit for making everyone white and but in China that's
that's
thing,
the thing.
Right?
I think it's yet another example of kind of being in a Western bubble and interpreting everything from that point of view. It's like, hey, they're making us white. That must mean that it thinks that black people are bad. It's like, well, no, that's just a cultural thing. They don't like dark skin. But I think Meitu is a really interesting a product of a cultural idiosyncrasy. There was a really good New Yorker piece recently interviewing people from Meitu and from Meipai. looking at why is it that this has become such a phenomenon in China, and I think at one point the CEO even said, well, it's rude not to beautify your friends. It's rude not to make them look better. Wouldn't you want your friends to make you look better too? And I think it was really interesting to see the reaction in some of my WeChat groups to that, and just kind of how Western culture is dealing with some of these trends that are coming out of China. And of course, I think that there is this fixation on authenticity in the West, that things should be sincere, that people should be representing themselves as their true self, not as their ideal self, and all these things. But at the same time, you look at Instagram, you look at Snapchat, you look at Facebook, and those are all ideal selves being represented, not authentic ones.
Yeah, maybe less Snapchat. I think Snapchat's pretty authentic, but certainly Facebook and Instagram especially. Yeah. You're right. So that is a great article as well, that New Yorker one. We should definitely link to that one. A bit of a long one, but just a really deep dive into a quite amazing part of Chinese society that we don't really experience. I feel very far away from the people being described. But anyhow, that's a trend. I mean, I think it's we'll see more of that, right? We're definitely going to 2018. I expect there'll be one or two more breakouts from China at least that will make it in the States and in Europe and places like that. And we might even see more than two. We might see several, because as we alluded to earlier, the sort of tides have changed. I think a lot of people have said this, right? Now it's not. It's moving. The innovation's happening in China, and then it's going outside. So, I would fully expect there to be another couple of Chinese homegrown apps or app categories, or just app economy phenomena that come out of China next year.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think that really my prediction is a bit more focused regionally. I would say looking at Southeast Asia, we're going to see a lot more activity, as I mentioned, not just from the big players, but also from the smaller players. So time to move on. And number 3, we have cryptocurrencies. So we're looking at ICOs and Bitcoin. I mean, I think that this was, a global phenomenon. This is very different from bike sharing or mobile payments, in the sense that what we saw in China was really a microcosm of what was happening around the rest of the world, where people were buying more and more into cryptocurrency. Even now, with Bitcoin exchanges banned in China, we can see that there's still so much activity with cryptocurrencies and with Bitcoin. It almost broke 20,000 USD. A few days ago, it dropped down to below 17,000. But you look at that growth, and it's absolutely. It's phenomenal, absolutely phenomenal. And so you look at so where does China come into play with all this, right? So with Bitcoin in particular, most of the mining is coming from China. The majority of Bitcoins that are created in China. A lot of the speculation around Bitcoin, at least in the beginning, was a lot of it was coming out of China, and a lot of speculation in general when it comes to cryptocurrencies was coming out of China. Even still, you can see that cryptocurrency exchanges, basically they just kind of moved to Japan and South Korea. Still fairly close. I have it on good authority that it's still possible to buy crypto with RMB. So it seems that there are.
It's possible.
Yeah. So there are still leaks in government regulation in terms of they've shut them down. They've shut down domestic operations, but RMB is still being used to buy crypto. And then of course the ICOs. I mean, like, the number of BS ICOs that came out of China really was phenomenal. There were, I think, quite a few legitimate ones, but at the same time, with ICOs, with an alternative way of financing a company, it's just asking for trouble. And there was even one coin. I'm not sure how serious they were, but it was basically the grass mud horse coin. And if you're familiar with this is Chinese internet slang that became popular back a while ago, by 2012, 2013, if memory serves. And so grass mud horse is a literal translation of Cao Ni Ma, which sounds like a very bad word that I don't want to say it, but it's basically you go do something to your mother. So I think that looking at the number of obviously BS ICOs in China, that it was just a great way for people to take advantage.
Yeah, no discussion of 2017 would be complete without mention of cryptocurrencies, in particular Bitcoin. And we've covered this with the episode together with Neil Woodfine, who is the organizer. He's been a real expert in the area, really, really deep in it, and organizes the Bitcoin meetup in Beijing for many years now. And as he alluded to in that podcast, a lot of the hardware I think most of the hardware that's used to mine Bitcoin is produced in China, right? So China's just so deeply integrated into the whole Bitcoin economy. Even though the exchanges are banned, there's still a lot of the Bitcoin in the world is owned by Chinese people, I imagine. We don't know how much, but in other ways, they're heavily still involved, even with the government forbidding it. And I expect there'll be more developments in 2018. Certainly, as you just said, John, the price is absolutely crazy right now. Everyone's kind of divided. A lot of people saying it's a bubble. Kind of hard to think it's not a bubble, I guess. Given if you just Google it and look at the chart, it's beyond exponential. It's kind of just like a flat line up almost in the last couple of weeks.
Yeah, it's crazy.
So I personally, I think there will be a correction, but having said that, I also do believe that something fundamental, we have crossed a boundary with Bitcoin, and it will be around for many years. It's not going away. And the long-term prospects for it as a store of value, I think are pretty good.
Yeah,
I think it is virtual gold.
Exactly. I think that's really the key. I mean, that Bitcoin has become, like the first. Well, I mean, that's not okay. Anyway, it's the first widely adopted, digital commodity. Because of course there are lots of digital purchases that you can make, in particular in video games. You can buy certain outfits and weapons and in-game currency and things like that. But Bitcoin, number one, it's decentralized, and so no one really controls it, which is the miners do to a certain degree, as we saw with Bitcoin Cash and with SegWit. The failed SegWit fork, that really this was a group of miners saying, what, we're going to start creating a different type of Bitcoin, and so there is this possibility of centralization in terms of who is processing the Bitcoins, who is processing the transactions, and then creating more Bitcoin. But I completely agree. It's something that's definitely here to stay. Whether or not it's going to become something more than a store of value, more than a medium of exchange, I think is very questionable. I don't see myself how it would be possible for it to become something more than that. That being said, I mean, the power of a decentralized currency or a decentralized commodity, I think is the potential is very, very. There's a lot of. I'm not even saying things correctly. the potential is absolutely amazing for what can be done. But I think that for myself and what I'm looking at, blockchain in and of itself and the applications thereof that can be created with blockchain technology are absolutely astounding. We talked with Neil. We also talked with Ling Kong from Dianrong about blockchain. Super interesting stuff. And so Neil's a bit. He I'm trying to think of a good way to say this. Neil's very hardcore about Bitcoin, and I think for him it's a bit difficult to see the value of other blockchains, and in particular ICOs, because I think again, I think he's right to a certain degree that most of the ICOs that we're seeing are a bunch of BS. I think that there are some ICOs that we have seen that will prove to be viable solutions, and you look at the actual process of the ICO. I'm thinking mostly of Filecoin, because Filecoin, they wanted to do an ICO. They were going to do an ICO, and like the day before, they said, "Okay, wait a second. Actually, guys, hang on. We're going to make sure that everything is okay with the SEC. We're going to make sure that we're following proper regulations for fundraising in the United States." And so I think that the fact that they would do that says that they are very serious about their product. Ethereum is a great example as well. They were the second. The Ethereum was the second kind of large cryptocurrency after Bitcoin. The number of developers that are looking at Ethereum and trying to build applications on top of it, I think just proves that it is a legitimate cryptocurrency, a legitimate crypto ecosystem, if you will. There's still a lot of challenges, in particular with Ethereum. It cannot scale. Recently, Kik, who did an ICO earlier this year for their Kin, so basically creating an internal economy on their messaging platform, they were using Ethereum, but now they're planning on moving to Stellar, which is a different crypto platform. But yeah, so I mean, it's very, very clear that Bitcoin, all the cryptocurrency as a group, is here to stay. Blockchain as a group is here to stay. It's just really going to be, what applications are we going to be seeing, and how many companies are actually going to fulfill their promises during the ICO. I mean, it's like Kickstarter. Kickstarter, you go on there, you make all these promises, you get a bunch of money, and then maybe nothing happens. So, I think that's exactly what we're seeing with ICOs.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely it's also a candidate for trend of the year. Maybe not China trend of the year, but tech trend of the year. I think it's got definitely a strong case, right? I mean, it's a breakout year for cryptocurrencies, without a doubt.
And that about does it for the first part of our year-end review of what's happened here in China. Make sure that you stay tuned. Next week we will be releasing the second part. And as always, if you enjoyed this episode, we'd really appreciate it if you left us a review on iTunes, or if you're on Pocket Casts or on Overcast, you can press that star button. It will recommend us to your network.